Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 most surprising cards from Kobolds and Catacombs. Now, what I mean by most surprising is essentially these are underrated cards. These are cards that, coming into the expansion, people thought weren't going to be very good, but it turns out, in fact, are quite playable, and maybe even impacting the meta in some pretty major ways. Now, how I determined the cards that were rated poorly is using the Vicious Syndicate pre-expansion poll. They basically asked everybody to rate cards from 1 to 5 stars, and a ton of Hearthstone community members went in and rated these cards and how good they thought they would be. So I essentially went to the bottom of the list, looked at which of these cards were really poorly rated, but actually are seeing some play, and that's how I figured out the 5 most surprising cards. These aren't just my personal most surprising cards, but cards essentially that all of us got wrong, myself included, and in fact have surprised us in some major ways. And these are cards that have surprised us specifically in positive directions. So they've gone from poorly rated to very played, not the other way around. Those will be disappointing cards that'll show up in another video. All that said, let's go ahead and jump into this list of the 5 cards that we all got wrong and are actually pretty good. Up first, we have Ren, the First Disciple, and this might just be the most surprising card of all. The Hearthstone community rated this as the 5th worst card in the entire Kobolds and Catacombs set. That's right, they thought it was worse than things like Runespear. It was way, way down there at the bottom, the 5th worst, and yet Ren the First Disciple is seeing a fair bit of play, of course, in Warlock control decks where Ren fits. I don't think anybody really knew just how good slower Warlock decks were going to be. I don't think anybody really anticipated Cube Lock being a thing. Ren doesn't always fit in those lists, and in fact, she's not being played right now in the most common versions of Cube Lock. But right when the expansion hit, Ren was in a ton of control Warlock decks. She worked. She's not necessarily going to be an influential part of the meta necessarily moving forward, but she's far from the 5th worst card in the set. I think the Hearthstone community, and myself included, identified how slow this card was going to be to get its effect off. Like, it takes forever to cast all the seals and then actually get Azari to go off. The thing we didn't perhaps calculate is that just as a 3/6 taunt, she's not that slow on turn 6 for herself. She's, of course, a little worse than Fin Creeper and those sorts of things, but the kind of card you still have a little bit of time to play in most matchups. And then her seals can just be extended value. They're basically just adding 5 extra cards to your deck where you get to summon some free demons. And then if perchance Azari actually goes off, then you've got this big game-ending sort of play. But even if it doesn't, if it just gets pulled from your Skull of the Minari, for instance, sometimes it's just a free 10/10. And hey, that's not too bad either. So I think a lot of us focused in on achieving the dream with Azari, but didn't realize there's actually some value to be gained along the way with Ren as well. And that makes her just a consistent piece in a control style deck. And I think that's why she's worked out fairly well. Certainly far better than I imagined. I think I gave this card 1 star and said it was way too slow to see play. And yet here we are. Ren is actually being played in competitive Hearthstone games, and that's pretty surprising. Moving on to the next most surprising card, we have the Grand Archivist. This is another card I thought would be awful. I said a lot of bad things about this one, but yet Grand Archivist is showing up quite a bit in the Kobolds and Catacombs meta, namely in the big spell priest that was popularized by the player Satellite. It turns out when Grand Archivist casts either Mind Control or Free from Amber, and only those 2 cards, it's not a bad turn 8 play after all. You get a Grand Archivist and an 8-drop from Free from Amber, and that's pretty sick, particularly in combination with the card Spiteful Summoner. Now, Spiteful Summoner could maybe arguably also be on this list, but people didn't rate it nearly as poorly as Grand Archivist. Grand Archivist got the exact same rating as King Togwaggle in the Runespear in the Vicious Syndicate poll, so clearly people thought this one was going to be pretty bad, but obviously a lot better than King Togwaggle in the Runespear. Grand Archivist, it turns out, actually is part of a little archetype that's making its way into Hearthstone now. I don't think Big Spell Priest is necessarily the end-all be-all of decks, but Grand Archivist has proved itself as a playable, competitive card at high ranks. This thing can still win games and be significant, and that's much more than anyone ever expected for this little kobold. Moving on to my next card, it's Paladin's Unidentified Maul. Now, this one did not get rated as poorly as the previous cards on the list, but it has been incredibly influential in Aggro Paladin, which is really the #1 deck in Hearthstone right now in the Kobolds and Catacombs meta. Unidentified Maul is being played in almost 12% of Hearthstone decks. That's just how big this card was. And although it wasn't rated terribly, it only got a 2.4 out of 5 with the community, which was in the lower half of all cards, and was similar to things like the Kobold Hermit. It got the same score as Kobold Hermit from Shaman, which is just an absolutely abysmal card. So Unidentified Maul clearly flew under the radar. I don't think anybody realized just how influential it was going to be because so many minions are going to be played by Paladin, and buffing those minions often leads to some really advantageous board states. Giving them plus attack can be great in an aggro deck. Giving them Divine Shield gives you so much extra survivability. And since Aggro Paladin is such a great deck and Unidentified Maul works so darn well in that deck, this one was a big surprise for me. I thought it'd be an okay card. I just didn't realize how great it was going to be and how dominant it was going to be. And that's exactly where we've landed. Unidentified Maul, really one of the better cards in the set so far. It might not feel like it. It might not feel like some powerhouse card. But in terms of how often it's played and how often you're seeing it, Unidentified Maul is near the very top of the list, so you can't ignore just how important this one has been. Pretty clearly a surprising card. For my next card, we have another Warlock one this time around. It is the Possessed Lackey. Now, this one was given only a rating of 2 out of 5 by the community, just barely putting it above cards like Temperous, for instance. That's how poorly people thought of Possessed Lackey. I wasn't too high on this card either. It just seemed like it was going to be really hard to use. Little did we know, when you have something like Voidlord and Doomguard as your only 2 demons in your deck, Possessed Lackey becomes incredibly powerful, especially when you can kill it off so easily with things like Dark Pact. Suddenly it becomes a much more consistent play and a very high rolly style play that can just swing games in your favor. Possessed Lackey clearly popular in the Q block style deck, where you have all those big demons and carnivorous cubes to use them in some pretty absurd ways. This card just fits perfectly as a way to suss out those demons either from your deck or also with Skull of Minari from your hand. When you add all that together, a very scary, threatening package that is clearly pretty dominant right now in the Hearthstone meta. I thought this card would never work, just too inconsistent. People found a way to make it work, and it's really kind of now the puzzle piece that connects everything in Q-Block and makes it work. That deck just couldn't exist without the added consistency of a card like Possessed Lackey, because you just can't play Doom Guards. Their risk is too high. Void Lords are just pretty slow at 9 mana. They're fine, but for that deck, you have to be able to cheat them out sooner. Possessed Lackey allows you to do that way too often, and that's why Q-Block right now is one of the more frustrating decks to play against, I think, in Hearthstone. But Possessed Lackey, clearly one of those cards that carved out a niche for itself, carved out a deck, and is seen everywhere on the ladder. An incredibly surprising addition to the Hearthstone meta, as far as I'm concerned, and with the Hearthstone community at large as well. And then finally, without question, the most underrated, the most surprising card, of course, in Kobolds and Catacombs belongs to Corridor Creeper. This was given only a 2.2 by the Hearthstone community at large. That's worse than Possessed Lackey. That's worse than some absolutely ridiculous cards. I think that's the 90th spot on the list. So people thought it was basically in like the bottom third of all cards in Kobolds and Catacombs. And of course, Corridor Creeper is the #1 card in Kobolds and Catacombs. By a large margin, I would argue. This thing is everywhere right now. It's in over 43% of decks. I can't remember ever seeing a card that was in that many decks on hsreplay.net since they started releasing that data. I think this is the most played card I've ever seen. It's ridiculous. It's far and away above everyone's expectations. Even if you thought this was a 5-star card, you still probably underrated it. It's just that strong. It's just that good. It's that influential. The entire meta is basically decks that either utilize Corridor Creeper in an offensive fashion, or decks that still slot it in a defensive fashion, or decks that just do something that doesn't care at all about Corridor Creepers because they have some other way to win the game. But the whole meta carves itself out around Corridor Creeper's influence right now. It's even better than a card like Bone Mare was, which was the most surprising card of Knights of the Frozen Throne. You just can't escape this guy. He is everywhere I hate it, and I'm disappointed by the fact that this is, in fact, the most surprising card in Kobolds and Catacombs by a mile. And there you go, folks. Those were the 5 most surprising cards in Kobolds and Catacombs, most of which I got wrong too. I thought Unidentified Maul would be okay, but certainly didn't think it would be quite this strong. It's pretty darn good, and the rest I got completely wrong as well. So I'm just like everybody else. We all make mistakes. We can't really see exactly what the meta holds in the future, and these are all some huge surprises to me, particularly Rin and Grand Archivist. I never could have dreamed those cards would be at all played. Now, some people might be wondering why cards like Rock Dalar and To My Side, these sort of all-spell hunter cards, didn't make this list, because if you look back when the expansion first released, everybody was hating on those cards, and then they actually saw a ton of play right as the expansion released. So a lot of people would consider those pretty naturally surprising cards, or cards that the community got incredibly wrong. The reason they didn't make this list for me is because most of the reason those saw play was sort of as a backlash to that community sentiment. In other words, people were trying to prove the community wrong by playing these cards and saying, actually, they're pretty good. But as the expansion has worn on over the next few weeks, we're now basically 3 or 4 weeks into the expansion period, we see that Rock Dalar and To My Side actually probably aren't all that good. They're okay. They're not as bad as people said. They're certainly not the worst cards in Hearthstone, which is language some people were using. But frankly, they're just not seeing much play. There are other versions of Hunter, and Hunter has lost a lot of momentum in the expansion too. It's just not a deck we see very often. So they really weren't all that surprising. They were okay, but they're not as good as the cards on this list and don't deserve the moniker of most surprising like the cards on this list. So that's my logic for leaving them out. All that said, if you guys have thoughts, comments, questions on these cards, other cards you thought were surprising, because clearly there are a handful of others that could have made it on this list pretty well too, so I know there's a lot of discussion about that coming, no doubt. I'm sure you think I missed some cards or got them wrong. Leave those thoughts in the comments below. Of course, I love seeing that stuff, but until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.